of allegiance of a new member. Announcements by the presiding officer. Members, I have received apologies from the minority leader on his absence from today's sitting. The leave requested is granted. Assembly bills sent back from Cabinet, Assembly laws brought back from Parliament, petitions, papers.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. On behalf of the Secretary for Finance and the Deputy Chief Secretary, I would like to lay the following paper, the Tobago House of Assembly monthly budget report as at the end of November 2019.
Presentation of reports from Dispute Resolution Commission, questions to secretaries, questions for oral answer. Members, due to the absence of the minority leader, his questions would be deferred to the next sitting. Minority Councillor. Good afternoon. Question number 75 to the Chief Secretary and Secretary of Education, Innovation and Energy. On Saturday, 9th November 2019, the Chief Secretary indicated that a task force was being set up to review the current challenges of the health sector. Please indicate A, if that task force was set up, outlining its commencement date and estimated completion date. B, the chairperson and other members of the task force. C, the specific terms of reference of the task force. And D, if the task force has not been established, please indicate the reason for such and the estimated date of establishment. Chief Secretary.
Thank you very much, Madam Presiding Officer. The first meeting of the task force was held on January 21st, 2020. And the committee's life initially is expected to run for a period of 4 weeks from the date of the commencement. The chairperson and other members of the task force are as follows. Chairperson, Mrs. Bernadette Solomon Koroma, Chief Administrator. The medical doctor, Dr. Anton Cumberbatch. Human resource consultant, Ms. Carol David. Member, Mr. Ashwood Lamont. and member of the public, Ms. Cecile Beckers. As follows: reviewing the organization structure of the TRHA to determine how the organization is managed and how personnel is distributed, reviewing the financial operations of the TRHA, reviewing levels of healthcare delivery through the operations of the TRHA, the CMO, and the Division of Health, Wellness, and Family Development, the utilization of resources, both human and non-human, as well as the maintenance of healthcare facilities. And therefore, D of the question is not applicable.
Minority Councillor. Thank you. Question number 76 to the Secretary of Health, Wellness and Family Development. In March 2019, the Division of Health, Wellness and Family Development indicated that a payroll audit of the Tobago Regional Health Authority was being conducted. In July 2019, the Secretary of Health, Wellness and Family Development indicated that the report of the audit would be made public. In September 2019, the Secretary of Health, Wellness and Family Development indicated that the Chief Executive Officer of the TRHA was scheduled to present recommendations to the TRHA Board of Directors at the next scheduled board meeting. Please indicate A, when the report of the TRHA payroll audit will be made available to the public and the method of such, the recommendations made by the Chief Executive Officer about the TRHA audit, and C, the recommendations that were adopted by the TRHA Board of Directors about the said audit.
Secretary of Health, Wellness and Family Development. Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. The report of the TRHA payroll audit will be made available to the public by a media release. This would be done following the next board meeting of the TRHA board in February. The recommendations made by the CEO about the audit include that these 7 persons on administrative leave be reinstated, and that the recommended measures be put in place to strengthen the internal processes as the auditors recommended. The recommendations adopted by the TRHA Board of Directors about the audit include the reinstatement of the 7 persons, and as such they have returned to work. The recommendations to strengthen the processes were adopted. Some were adopted immediately, while others require further internal discussion. However, all recommendations coming out of the exercise will be fully implemented. I thank you.
Follow up, Madam. As a follow-up, please indicate the estimated date of the board meeting in February.
The first week of February is our standard board meeting date, the first Thursday, and the expectation is that that will persist into February.
Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Assembly on definite matters of urgent public importance. Statements by secretaries or assistant secretaries. Personal explanations. Introduction of bills. Motions relating to the business or sittings of the Assembly and moved by a secretary or assistant secretary. Public business, private business. Motion.
Member for Palo to Via Lands for Miss Speyside.
Thank you very much, Madam Presiding Officer. Let me begin by wishing all my colleagues, many of whom I have not seen in person, for the year 2020, a Happy New Year. Let me also extend New Year wishes for you as well, Madam Presiding Officer, and of course to the entire island of Tobago and by extension our brothers and sisters in Trinidad. 2020 hopefully will be a prosperous year for all of us, a year in which we will have good health, which will mean a reduction in the numbers of expenditure for healthcare, because we will all be healthy and happy. And we pray above all things else that God will guide Tobago throughout this year 2020. Today I wish to put before this House a motion that I think is extremely important for our discussions today. In fact, if we should do a poll of Tobagonians and we should poll what are some of their most pressing concerns, I believe that this will perhaps be in the top 5 of those pressing concerns of every Tobagonian. The motion reads, whereas it is a widely held perception that the cost of living in Tobago is generally higher than that of Trinidad, and whereas there is no recent study to examine the current cost of living differentials between both islands, and whereas some Tobagonians attempt to circumvent the high costs of goods and services by going to Trinidad to shop, and whereas the Supermarkets Association of Trinidad and Tobago warned in a statement dated January 4th, 2020, that there will be price increases as suppliers have increased their prices, and whereas the duties and consumption taxes attached to goods and services exacerbate the problem for residents and even make tourism and other products and services on the island less competitive, be it resolved that this House asks the Executive Council to commission an extensive study on the cost of living differentials between both islands and the merits of duty-free and/or tax-free initiatives for the island, and be it further resolved that the report of this study be laid in this House and that this study be used to inform policy initiatives to treat with the economic realities of Tobagonians. Madam Presiding Officer, this term cost of living is really just the level of prices for a range of everyday goods and services. When we are looking at the cost of living, we tend to look at the cost of food, the cost of housing, in particular rent, or even mortgage payments. We look at the cost of utilities. We look at the cost of transportation, the cost of clothing, the cost for building materials via the hardware. We look at cost of furniture, cost of clothing, cost of education. In other words, what does it cost us to live in Tobago? If we are to put in dollars and cents a value for living in Tobago, what does it cost us? Now, of course, the optimistic Tobagonian will say, well, since Tobago is the closest thing to heaven, then no price is too high for living in Tobago. But the reality is, all of our people are not rich, are not wealthy. And so we have to consider the cost of living in Tobago for all of our people. What does it cost us to live on this island? In the motion, I started off by saying that it is a widely held perception that the cost of living in Tobago is greater than that of Trinidad. And I'm saying, using the word perception, because I am aware that there are some things that are cheaper in Tobago than in Trinidad. There are some things that carry the same prices in Tobago as in Trinidad. But I'm also aware that there are many things that are cheaper in Trinidad than Tobago. And that's why the motion also acknowledges that several Tobagonians from time to time will find themselves going down on the boat to buy goods and even services and then come back to Tobago. We see them all the time. We bounce upon them in Price Mart. We see them getting hardware supplies because there's this perception that if I go to Trinidad to purchase these items, I will get a better bang for my buck. But are they wrong? And in many cases, I believe that they are right. The areas where the costs are the same, those areas tend to be areas where there are government subsidies or where there are standardized prices across the country. So, for example, the price for gasoline at the pump is the same. Unlike some states, including federal states where prices will vary from pump to pump, in Trinidad and Tobago, the price is more or less the same across the board. And that happens in areas, Madam Presiding Officer, where there are government subsidies applied or where there is a standardized price structure for that particular item. There are other areas, a few other areas where the goods are actually cheaper in Tobago than in Trinidad. For example, the price of fish. And I was alarmed to learn that if I am to go to Trinidad to buy a piece of kingfish, I will have to pay close to $100 for a pound. And the regular, ordinary, everyday fish that we sometimes turn our backs on, at least where I live, the albacore and so on, is as high as $50 a pound. And I got that from NAMDEVCO's National Agricultural Market Information Systems. That's the prices that they have for wholesale, not even for retail. But almost every day when I hear the conch shell blowing outside my house, and it's a signal that there's fish at the bay, and I go there, I will get the ordinary fish, albacore, and I'll even get kingfish for $20 a pound. And I'll get what we call in Speyside bankfish, that's your redfish and your grouper and so on, for $25 a pound. If I go to neighboring Charlottesville, the price isn't much different. It's $20 for the albacore and so on, and kingfish and the bankfish is $25. If I come down to Pigeon Point side, the price also isn't much different. I'm told that I could get shark for $15, but I don't eat shark, so that doesn't apply to me. But shark for $15, and you could get fish between that $15 and $25 price range. The point I'm making is that there are some goods and services on the island of Tobago that are cheaper than in Trinidad. And what accounts for that might be the fact that it is a primary industry, or that we have some production source locally, and so we can produce it at a cheaper price. But there are many things that are more expensive in Tobago than in Trinidad. And of course, the reasons for the cost of living in Tobago being more expensive than Trinidad will vary. It isn't just because our businessmen are all wicked and that they're all price gouging. It varies. So for example, if we look at transportation, I can take the 29-kilometer journey from Arima to Port of Spain and pay $8. But if I go 13 kilometers from Scarborough to Crown Point, it's $10. I can go from San Fernando to Port of Spain, which is 51 kilometers, for $15. But Speyside to Scarborough, which is about half of that, 25 kilometers thereabout, I pay $14, $1 less. So transportation is higher. What accounts for that? Well, it's not just that the maximum and drivers are wicked, but we also have this thing called economies of scale. And while in Trinidad, there are tons more people, a lot more people to move from point A to point B, and you also have a lot more maxis or you have a larger competitive pool for transportation. In Tobago, we don't. And so that affects the cost of living insofar as transportation. In trying to research for this motion, I went to the Department of Planning to find out what information they do have, if they have any at all, because I would have framed and reframed this motion, trying to take in account that we may actually have some information on the ground. What I got from planning was a study done in 2009, and I was told that previous to that, a study was done in 2004. And in this 2009 study, it indicated that for vegetables at the Scarborough market, that was up to 75% higher, than Trinidad. But of course, this is not a recent study. This is 2009. This is a decade ago. And maybe things could have changed for the better or for the worst. Either or. Building materials at the time was 46.23%. But this is 2009. But there is no argument, generally, from my observation, and for those of us who still go to the supermarket and actually purchase our own groceries. And I am a bachelor now, so when in the past I wouldn't have to purchase groceries for myself, I must now purchase groceries for the household. And it will appear as if the costs of food items in Tobago generally are more expensive than Trinidad. Again, some will opine that that's the result of the transportation costs being added to the operating costs and that being passed on to the consumer. And so we pay a higher price for goods at the supermarket. But I was particularly intrigued by what I saw happening with the hardware sector. And what I did is that I sent quotations to 3 hardwares for the purpose of building a 30 by 20 foundation. So we're looking at a very small property, 30 by 20 foundation. I got an estimate from a builder in the village, and I sent it to 3 hardwares. I sent it to Dave and Daughters, which is a hardware located right in Speyside. I sent it to Armando's Hardware, which is one located in Scarborough. And I sent it to another one called Claxton Bay Hardware Limited. And the reason why I chose Claxton Bay Hardware Limited is because I recognize that several of my villagers have been patronizing this hardware, and they have been delivering the goods to Speyside by their property. So I said, this is interesting. Let me see if there is some merit behind that. And when I look at the cost comparatively for a 30 by 20 feet property, Claxton Bay Hardware, inclusive of transporting the materials from Trinidad, from Claxton Bay to Speyside, was $18,015. Armando's Hardware was 22.5% higher at $22,068.37. And Dave and Daughters Hardware was 18.6% higher at $21,365.79. So the country hardware cheaper than the one in town, which is not always the case for all goods and services, because when you live in the countryside, you know, sometimes those folks with a little parlor and so on does hit you with some inflationary prices that you have no choice but to pay, because they have sometimes a monopoly on the market, or that might be the only parlor in the village that have that one product that you want. So where you go? Do you go back? You have to buy it. But in this case, we are seeing for hardware, supplies and materials being approximately on average 20% higher than in Trinidad, just from this very small research that I did. And what this says is that if I have $100,000 to put towards building a small property, if I have to get those materials, it's better I go to Claxton Bay Hardware. Because what I will get for $100,000 from Claxton Bay Hardware in Trinidad, I will have to pay $120,000 on average in Tobago. So that is higher. And so there are merits to the conversation about the cost of living in Tobago being higher than in Trinidad. So what do we do? Because in addition to the cost of living generally being higher in Tobago than in Trinidad, we must factor in the reality that on top of that, we will have the consumption tax of 12.5%. On top of that, you will have duties, so whatever you import, and all of those things are added to the price. And in the resolution of the motion, two things are proposed. The first thing is that we conduct a study. And the reason why I'm saying we should conduct a study is because if we have to come up with the best solution to the problem, then we have to sit down and study it. I even tried reaching out to the CSO to get some statistics. And up to this morning, I'm still waiting on the data from them. Because they told me, yes, we do collect data on prices on both islands because we needed to calculate inflation and so on. But I haven't received it as yet. And that speaks volumes about why for us in Tobago, in a very autonomous way, we must begin, well, we do it in some regard, but we must, in all regards, collect data, do the research that's necessary, and stockpile the data. This is information that I should be able to get readily at planning if I ask them. Perhaps we should consider having a database that I could plug into and just have access to the research information. Because it's not just politicians who will require this kind of data. You will have social scientists who from time to time will want this data. You will have business people who will want this data, those in the banking sector who will want this data. And so having data is an imperative. And that's why we must conduct our own study, an extensive study, on the cost of living differentials between both islands. But while we are doing that, I felt it important for us to also take the time out to see if there is any merit in having duty-free and or tax-free initiatives for the island. Because as I was toying with this, one economist said to me, well, we should make Tobago tax-free. We remove all taxes. And I thought I was socialist until I heard that opinion. And I said, Farley, I'm not that socialist. I don't see how we could operate with zero taxes, especially for an island that is desirous of becoming more autonomous. And then some folks say, well, we should have duty-free zones. And I've asked my colleague, Councillor Faith B. Israel, Dr. Faith B. Israel, to look specifically at the benefits, the merits somewhat of duty-free zones and how that could be implemented given what our laws are saying in Trinidad and Tobago. But some people believe we should have duty-free zones outside of our ports, where people can shop, and if you have your passport, quite like we see in Barbados, you can go into the shopping districts and shop duty-free. But these duty-free zones, as we see modeled across the Caribbean, they don't really benefit the locals. They benefit the visitor. But more than that, they benefit those who provide tourism services. Because we have had that cry from those in the tourism sector, some of whom have been saying, well, the cost of alcohol to us in Tobago for our restaurants and our hotels is significantly more than the cost to those operating in Latin America. And so when we compare, it's much more difficult for us to give a better package and better offerings to our guests than those in Latin America. And that's some of the complaints you hear from them, especially when you ask them, but why can I take the same money I'm spending for a weekend at your hotel and fly out of the country and spend a weekend all-inclusive? Why is your price that equivalent? And that's the excuse they will give. And so this whole question of the cost of living does not just impact those of us who live on the island, but it impacts those of us who are in the tourism sector and who want to offer services to those visiting our shores. Because chances are we'll be offering those services at a higher cost if it is we have to purchase the materials at a higher cost in Tobago. And the motion also resolves that we should lay this study in the House, and that we should use this study to inform policy initiatives to treat with the economic realities of Tobagonians. And I did speak about some people wanting to have tax-free measures for the island. And I also found that to be problematic. Because if it is, we could say, for example, Tobago would pay less than 12.5% VAT. But that will certainly cause some friction. That could even engender a black market that we don't want. And so perhaps a better policy might be for us to increase the wages of Tobagonians. But then that too comes with higher cost on our recurrent expenditure. So the ultimate question is, what are the policy measures that can work? And that's why this study will look at the merits and the demerits of tax-free initiatives and duty-free initiatives, along with looking at what is the actual cost of living differential at this present moment. And perhaps it will urge us to pay more attention, to increasing local production, because we have realized that in some areas where it's a primary industry and where there is a production on the island, we can have some of the goods and services at a cheaper cost. Maybe we should look into warehouse development. Maybe we should look at port development, and I know that's something that we have been talking about for a while. People previous to this administration spoke about it. Folks in this administration spoke about it, about Tobago having a port as a way of cutting out the middleman. Because Trinidad and Tobago as a whole, we import most of our goods from outside of the country, and especially from the metropolitan states in the country, particularly the United States. And so they import it to Trinidad, there are duties attached to that, and then we must take it from Trinidad, transport it to Tobago, there's a cost attached to that, and then of course, the businessman must say, I have to put something on it for myself. I have also found that another contributing factor to the high cost of living is that many of our business people, either they don't know how to do pricing, or they choose not to do good pricing. Notice I'm not calling them wicked. And the reason why I'm saying that is, if I bring a bale of rice via the ferry to Tobago, there's no reason why I have to attach the same transportation cost on every single bag of rice in that bale. There's no reason. And if on the truck there is rice, flour, sugar, meats, drinks, then I could pay for that transportation cost once and allow the prices of the other goods and to be reasonable. But I have found from my observation that many of our proprietors choose to attach that transportation cost to every single item on their shelf. And so we must bear that cost. And so we need to study this, our cost of living at the moment, study it carefully and extensively, and then use that to now inform policy. And while we are studying it, we must look at whether or not there are merits or demerits to suggestions of having duty-free zones and or tax-free initiatives. Because Tobagonians have been paying far too much for goods and services on the island. And there is an impact to a high cost of living. There is an impact for households. Because it means then that we will take a much longer time to get to where we need to get to as a family. I have known several households who have been building their homes for donkey years. In fact, if you are a stranger to this island, it will look as though Tobago is experiencing a mass construction boom. But if you are a resident on the island, you will realize that several of these buildings have been at this same point for a while. And I'm not talking about just government buildings, I'm talking generally across the board. I'm talking including people building private homes. People have been building, and not nearing completion for a while. It's not uncommon to find families in Tobago who 5-10 years, they're building bit by bit. And then another thing layer that adds to that is the issue of the land titles. And so if it is you can't go to the bank because you don't have proper title for your land, you can't go to the bank to get a mortgage, it means you must bill out of pocket, or whenever you get a back pay, you build up a little piece and then you wait again, you take a small loan, you build a piece, when you pay that off, you take a next small loan, and so we keep going. And so there is a cost to all of this. There is a cost to family. When it is, I see some Tobagonians saying, well, I go in Princeton. I'm saying, well, why are you going quite Princeton? I find Princeton is such a far drive and so cumbersome to get to. But people go in Princeton to buy work clothes, to buy school stuff. And I'm saying, well, what about here? It's cheaper there. And as I'm saying, there are some merits to that. As I've shown with the hardware, as we see when we go to shop for clothing, and so on, that some of the things are more expensive here, plenty of things are more expensive here than there. We also have to look at the fact that if it is the cost of living is higher in Tobago, it means that we individually have less money to invest in innovation and in anything else. So if it is my dream is to become a fashion designer and to invest in that, with the cost of living, what you are left to save is far less, and so it will take the average Tobagonian a longer time to get to that place. And so this motion, Madam Presiding Officer, really is asking us to do an extensive study into the cost of living on the island, look at what it costs us to live here in all sectors, not unlike the study I got from planning, which basically looked at what happens with the hardware and the supermarkets and the market. It has to be wider than that. It has to be broader than that. We have to include rent. We have to include transportation. Everything that comprises our living on the island. What does it cost us to live on the island? And after doing that study, we should then use that information to inform us as to whether or not there are merits to the argument for duty-free zones and or tax-free initiatives. And we should use that study to inform general policy of the THA. And that study will not just help the THA, but as I indicated, it will also help those with private enterprise. Because now they have a real sense of what I could peg my business against, what I could get into, how do I shape up, how do I improve? Because, for example, I find it strange that a hardware in Speyside could give me a whole 2.5% less price than Scarborough, but in all 20% less than Trinidad. It means then that something is up, something is fishy. And we could do more, whether it is with consumer affairs, in terms of price management and regulation. We need to do more to manage the cost of living on the island, because there is an impact for families. There is an impact for those of us who live on the island. And who knows, maybe this is the high cost of living may be one of those push factors that pushes people into Trinidad and elsewhere to live. And that's something for us to consider. Even as economists far and wide tell us that we need to increase our population. Perhaps if we manage the cost of living on the island, more people might return and live on the island and give us the economies of scale that we need. Or maybe that is wishful thinking. But we have to explore it. And I hope today, Madam Presiding Officer, that as we hear from the other side, they will be willing to do some of this exploration with me, that they will be willing for us to do that detailed examination of the cost of living on the island and the merits of tax-free and or duty-free measures, and then to bring that study here so that we can inform THA policies and so that the private sector can use it to gauge their own policy management. Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer.
Members, the question is, whereas it is a widely held perception that the cost of living in Tobago is generally higher than that of Trinidad, and whereas there is no recent study to examine the current cost of living differentials between both islands, and whereas some Tobagonians attempt to circumvent the high costs of goods and services by going to Trinidad to shop, and whereas the Supermarkets Association of Trinidad and Tobago warned in a statement dated January 4, 2020, that there will be price increases as suppliers have increased their prices, and whereas the duties and consumption taxes attached to goods and services exacerbate the problem for residents and even make tourism and other products and services on the island less competitive, be it resolved that this House asks the Executive Council to commission an extensive study on the cost of living differentials between both islands and the merits of duty-free and or tax-free initiatives for the island, and be it further resolved that the report of this study be laid in this House and that this study be used to inform policy initiatives to treat with the economic realities of Tobagonians. Deputy Chief Secretary and Secretary of Finance and Economy.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer, and I welcome the opportunity to join the debate at this time on a motion brought to us by the member of this Honorable House of Palatovier, Lansome Speyside, which essentially seeks to solicit the support of members on this side of the House and to request of the Executive Council that a study be commissioned on the cost of living differential between Tobago and Trinidad, and also to examine the demerits and merits of making Tobago a duty-free zone and of making certain products and services in Tobago tax-free. Madam Presiding Officer, let me say at the onset that the issue brought by the member opposite is an important one. We don't deny that. However, I must state that the motion on its face is erroneous and misleading, in that it posits or it gives the impression that nothing has been done to address the issue of the cost of living differential between Trinidad and Tobago, and that none of the issues are being monitored or addressed, and additionally, that there is no recent study conducted by the Assembly in monitoring the overall cost differential. And Madam Presiding Officer, this is far from the truth. But let me say at the onset, Madam Presiding Officer, that we on this side, that we are fully cognizant of the fact there's an inextricable link between the cost of living and the standard of living and the quality of life of our people in Tobago. There's a direct link between the cost of living, the standard of life, and the quality of life of our people. But it was as far back as 2006, just before entering the Division of Finance and Economy as a technocrat, just before I got there in 2007, that Kyrie Consultants Limited was engaged by the Division of Finance and Enterprise Development at the time to conduct a study on the cost of living differential between Trinidad and Tobago. And I want to give the historical antecedent so that we can appreciate the road that we have traveled since 2006 and to where we are. But again, I want to inform the member opposite, and he indicated quite so of the challenges which he faced in terms of obtaining the data. He checked CSO, still waiting on the data, went to planning. They had a dated copy, but during my presentation, Madam Presiding Officer, I would outline that we are continually monitoring the situation. So as far back as 2006, a study was done by the division, and what we found, it was still that the prices were generally higher in Tobago than in Trinidad, and particularly with respect to perishable food items and building materials. In fact, the study found that the construction cost of a standard 3-bedroom home in Tobago was approximately 25% higher than that of Trinidad. The difference in the cost of living between the islands, the study attributed to a number of issues, including, Madam Presiding Officer, the transportation costs, the transaction costs associated with port handling operations and charges, worker productivity, and market and structure. Arising from this study, several recommendations were advanced to address the existing differentials that existed. These included improvements in the port operations and the development of a system to improve transparency and also to ensure the equitable treatment of all users of the port facilities serving Tobago. At the time, the recommendation was also the provision of vessels for the seepage, and this was as far back as 2006. I'm quoting the study. With your leave, Madam Presiding Officer, the provision of flatbeds to improve cargo handling between Trinidad and Tobago, including refrigerated cargo facilities. And let me say that based on this recommendation, the Assembly funded the acquisition of flatbeds so that persons bringing up foodstuff would not have to pay the cost of these flatbeds. This was done by the Assembly. The report also recommended that the labor shortages in Tobago be addressed and also that reforms be undertaken with some of the services provided by the Assembly and where possible the implementation of aggressive programs for work upgrade. There was also another recommendation which included the support for agriculture in Tobago with special reference to vegetable production and the provision of infrastructure support in respect of the farm-to-market system and storage facilities, the encouragement of production in Tobago, leading to the backhauling of supplies to Trinidad, with the potential of opening up the possibility of Tobago to be a direct port of call, and improvement of the competitive environment in Tobago by the provision of support by way of loans and other forms of facilitation to support and expand the SME or the small and micro enterprises. Madam Presiding Officer, the Division of Finance and the Economy followed up that initial study by Kyrie in 2006 with another study again in 2010. And the study this time found a higher cost of living in Tobago than in Trinidad. And some of the primary recommendations coming out of this study included the relaxation of VAT on the inputs to the construction industry, which included sand, gravel, cement, and so on in Tobago, a differential application of property tax in Tobago, the introduction of a security tax, improved detection rates in Tobago and to deter crime on the island, the provision of venture capital to build a much-needed domestic private sector, which would be capable of being the engine of economic activity or the powerhouse of development in Tobago in the future. Another recommendation was the creation of real estate investment trusts, or REITs, and partly as a protective device, but also to manage the appreciation of real estate for the benefit of Tobagonians and for the reorganization of wealth. But for us to respect to the venture capital program, Madam Presiding Officer, we are well aware that the Assembly invested $25 million to establish a venture capital fund. It is functioning and is under the Division of Finance and Economy. With respect to the creation of real estate investment trust, and this is an excellent idea, and it's one for which I know a number of private sector persons have been clamoring for, but this initiative requires some amendments to the current tax legislation. But this is an excellent idea in terms of getting investment in real estate and for us to really accelerate the pace of housing and other commercial real estate and to expand the housing stock on the island. But what will be required is tax reform or the necessary amendments to the tax legislation. But Madam Presiding Officer, since taking over the helm at the Division of Finance and Economy, we have continued to keep a very keen eye on the cost of living between Tobago and Trinidad and to identify the necessary strategies to address the existing differential. Because, Madam Presiding Officer, and the member opposite used the example of fish. You know, you can purchase fish in Tobago, and that is a business. So persons come and buy all the fish from the fisher folk in Tobago. They go down to Trinidad, and they mark it up by sometimes 100%, and they label it Tobago fish. And that is a business. So the same point in terms of the cost, the differential in cost between one state, one city, and another is clearly reflected in the example. And that is why, in addition to fishing, we also gave some recommendations as to how we in Tobago can benefit as well from that cost differential. But as recent as 2017, in the division, the Economic Management and Research Unit, in collaboration with the Department of Consumer, the Department of Cooperatives, they conducted a study on the cost differential between Tobago and Trinidad, and they continue to monitor these prices on a quarterly basis. The study reviewed the cost of a standard basket of goods comprising 63 items and compared them to the same basket of goods with supermarkets in different sub-regions in Trinidad, including Port of Spain, Arima, Chaguanas, San Fernando, and Cuba. Madam Presiding Officer, we had persons who were on the ground in these various supermarkets, ensuring that we were comparing like with like, apples with apples. The study surprisingly showed that the total cost of this basket of items in the large supermarkets in Tobago, that they were not significantly different from the total cost of the same basket of items in the supermarkets in different subregions in Trinidad. I want to repeat that. The study surprisingly showed that the total cost of food items in the large supermarkets in Tobago, that the prices were not significantly different from the total cost of the same items in the supermarkets in different subregions in Trinidad. As it relates to the small and medium-sized supermarkets, the study showed that the total cost of the 63 items in Tobago, the cost was only marginally higher than the total cost of items in different subregions in Trinidad. The study also went on to review the construction sector and to look at construction costs of a standard 2-bedroom and a standard 3-bedroom house in Tobago versus that in Trinidad. And what we found was that the construction cost was approximately 30% higher in Tobago than in Trinidad. And this is where we have the challenge, Madam Presiding Officer. So again, Madam Presiding Officer, I stand to correct the member when he said that there are no recent studies, and this is not accurate. And let me start, we have been monitoring this issue of the cost of living differential between the both islands for some time. And what we have seen, Madam Presiding Officer, is that imported or transferred costs, and as well the transportation costs. And one thing that must be credited to this administration is the number of initiatives that we have undertaken coming out of these studies to address the issues of the cost of living differential between Tobago and Trinidad. One of the factors accounting for the higher cost of goods in Tobago is directly attributed to the transportation costs. As we know, and as the member also alluded to, a significant number of what we consume, of the goods sold in Tobago, comes to the island via the sea bridge. And that transaction and transportation costs and other costs associated with importing goods, they are passed on to the consumer. We continue, Madam Presiding Officer, to work diligently to address all the issues on the sea bridge. And in this regard as well, Madam Presiding Officer, we continue to work with our friends at the level of the central government so that we find feasible and sustainable solutions to the problem on the sea bridge. And since the introduction of the Galleon's Passage and the Jean de la Vallée, we can say with a great degree of confidence that there has been significant improvements in the inter-island transportation system. And we seldom hear anybody cussing, quarreling about the sea bridge anymore, because that problem has been fixed. And when I talk to the business persons and I talk to persons on the port, we have excess capacity, cargo capacity on the sea bridge. And the Jean de la Vallée provides luxurious accommodation and additional capacity for 800 passengers and 230 cars. The Cabo Star currently has a capacity of 130 passengers and 300 trucks and cars. And in the mid-2020, the estimated time is around May or June. The arrangements on the sea bridge will be further enhanced by the arrival of the 2 new state-of-the-art fast ferries, now under construction by the Australian companies Incat and Austral Ships. But Madam Presiding Officer, another strategy of this administration to address the cost of living differential between Tobago and Trinidad relates to our ongoing efforts to establish a cargo handling port in Tobago. It was only last year that a feasibility study for the cargo port was completed, and the various options coming out of that feasibility study is currently being reviewed. A cargo port in Tobago would allow Tobago entrepreneurs and Tobago business persons to engage in direct trade with the rest of the world rather than shipping goods via Trinidad. It will also allow for the direct access of imported raw materials and also facilitate the export of finished goods. Madam Presiding Officer, a few years ago, I participated in a trade mission to Miami, and was having conversation at the time with one of the major shipping lines. And when I mentioned Tobago and the fact that what are the possibilities of having a direct shipping line to Tobago, the person was excited. And I started, as I would do once I'm on an international mission, promote Tobago, talk about Tobago. They were excited about the prospects. Additionally, when we did that exchange program in Jamaica last year, May, we toured the port facility operated under a PPP arrangement between the government of Jamaica and one of the major shipping lines. And coming out of that tour, Madam Presiding Officer, I saw the full potential of us having a container handling port in Tobago and the possibilities of using the PPP modality.
Member, you have 10 more minutes.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. But, Madam Presiding Officer, we can also point to, as part of our strategy to treat with the cost of living differential and to treat with the imported cost of raw material, would be the restoration of the Barbados jetty located at Studley Park. The jetty facilitates the berthing of barges for the transportation of and export of aggregate, and also facilitates the importation of and offloading of construction material like sand and cement. And as a result, Madam Presiding Officer, what we have seen is that this facility would also greatly impact on the price differential of construction and the construction costs of houses in Tobago. And as I have alluded to earlier, the imported construction costs, when you compare the construction cost of a house in Trinidad vis-a-vis Tobago is upwards of 30%. So we see the Barbados jetty playing a significant role in also reducing the cost of living differential between Tobago and Trinidad. Another strategy, given the fact that we look at the food costs bill here on the island, Madam Presiding Officer, another strategy of this administration has been to improve agricultural production on the island. And Madam Presiding Officer, given my limited time, I would just, talk about the Agricultural Access Roads program for farmers, the capacity and enhancement and other training programs for current farmers and for potential farmers for us to improve farming production and for us to increase output. We could talk about the work at the Tissue Culture Lab, our desire to encourage the involvement of young people in technology, and we can go on and on. But Madam Presiding Officer, I just want to update and before I update persons on our work in treating with data, Madam Presiding Officer, one of the recommendations coming out of this study as well was for us to invest in the SME sector. And if it's another success story coming out of this administration, continues to be our investment in small and enterprise development and to the micro and meso sector. So we can talk about our work at the enterprise development and BDU under our Enterprise Assistance Fund and grant programs, and as well our investment in venture capital, totaling well over $100 million or so, and the assistance rendered to a number of persons to start their business. And that is why, Madam Presiding Officer, a number of entrepreneurs are showcasing their stuff in Trinidad. As it relates to, also linked to the cost of living, Madam Presiding Officer, is the issue of inflation. And when I assumed office as Secretary of Finance, we had a very serious issue of inflation, but in particular, Madam Presiding Officer, food price inflation. And if you if you would have examined my 2015 budget statement, from that time, inflation was in double digits. And since that time to now, Madam Presiding Officer, as it relates to the last inflation, the recent inflation figures as at August 2019, Madam Presiding Officer, the central bank suggests that Tobago's headline and food price inflation is approximately 2% and 2.9% respectively. For the 12-month period ending August 2019, our headline and food price inflation rates averaged 2% and 1% respectively. So the issue of inflation, Madam Presiding Officer, is also under control here in Tobago. And given the fact that the high prices and transaction costs and that imported cost and knock-on effect is well under control, given our recent inflation figures. Madam Presiding Officer, how much time do I have remaining?
You have 3 minutes more.
3 minutes. Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. The motion also alludes to making Tobago a duty-free and tax zone. I didn't hear any information on this from the member, but he also indicated that his colleague, Councillor Israel, will outline the measures, and we wait to hear the recommendations. But let me also say that this is also being actively pursued in collaboration with the Ministry of Trade and the Division of Finance in terms of making Cove a duty-free zone. This is something that we will be working on in the near future with the Ministry of Trade. But Madam Presiding Officer, as I wind up and allow the debate to continue, I am glad that my friend made the recommendation of doing a study. We have been monitoring it, and we have no objections to the recommendation in principle. And I think that he understands, and I also appreciate the need for research in policy formulation. And we have no objections, but we have the recent study, and we will continue to manage and to ensure that we monitor the cost of living differential between Trinidad and Tobago. As it relates to data and research, we continue to work with all the agencies, CSO, and Central Bank and others. And later on, we'll be working directly with CARTAC to also expand our research capacity, and also in terms of improving our GDP estimation and other pieces of important research that we deem necessary and important to Tobago. With that, Madam Presiding Officer, I thank you for the opportunity to join the debate. Thank you.
Minority Councillor.
Good afternoon again, Presiding Officer, to the members of the House. I guess I should also join my colleagues in being that this is the first sitting of 2020 to really wish each of us a good year, a blessed year, a prosperous year, one that includes us being able to overcome any and all obstacles, regardless of what they may be, because regardless of what, we do live in this wonderful space known as the capital of paradise, and it's an amazing space to live. Madam Presiding Officer, I am elated with the potential vision of a better Tobago that can be realized if the contents of this motion brought by my colleague is actually executed. This shows, Madam Presiding Officer, that we are critically thinking about what we need to do on the ground, and also critically thinking about what needs to happen to actually happen for change to really take effect. Because we live in Tobago, Madam Presiding Officer. Yes, though the motion speaks to having a formal study, many of us can say from very anecdotal, everyday living that it is pretty difficult because the cost of living in Tobago is exponentially higher than that of Trinidad, that we feel the pinch. In many instances, when we speak to the man on the ground, for example, there was a young lady who met me recently, and she looked at me and she said, Christmas was hard, in a way that I had not really thought. Because when you looked at her eyes, you can tell that it was really a difficult Christmas for her, and that makes January, as we say, the 90 days of January, even harder. And given that we have that multiplying effect, we know that the average Tobagonian is forced to pinch pennies to ensure that we live and that we make it. Because, as outlined by both my colleague, Assemblyman Farley, and by the member for Bacolet, Mount St. George, that the reality is that the cost of food, the cost of building materials, the cost of so many things really is more expensive here. Madam Presiding Officer, I would be relatively brief because my colleague asked me specifically to look at the possibility of designating not just a part of Tobago, but the possibility of designating all of Tobago, the entire island of Tobago, as a duty-free zone. We are all excited. I am sure we've all expressed that excitement of having traveled internationally and being able to shop in the duty-free shops in the airport, because we can say without question that the rum is going to be a little cheaper, that the perfume is going to be a little cheaper, that the chocolate is going to be a little cheaper. What we are looking at, Madam Presiding Officer, is what is known as having what are known as special economic zones, SEZs. And this is where within a country, there are specific areas that have different rules as it relates to what the laws are and what can happen in those areas. These SEZs generally do several things. They help with trade, they increase employment, they increase investments, and they can have improved administrative effects because of the lower costs associated with those businesses. Madam Presiding Officer, just so that we are clear, there are several different types of SEZs. And according to the World Bank, in the report entitled Special Economic Zones, Performance, Lessons Learned, and Implications for Zone Development, there are about 6 specific areas, and I want to go through them quickly and situate where we are suggesting Tobago falls in those listings. The first is what are known as free trade zones. These are also known as commercial free zones, which are basically fenced-in duty-free areas which offer warehousing, storage, distribution, and so forth. The other is known as export processing zones. And as it says, that deals specifically with things that you export. So it's really the area where you process those things that you know you are going to use outside. So it's giving you the advantage when you compete outside. The third is what is known as enterprise zones, which are intended to revitalize depressed urban or rural zones. So you know that because of the economic situation of that specific area, you're going to focus on those areas with possibly tax incentives, financial grants, and so forth, knowing that that particular region, that particular village, that particular town, that particular district needs the help. The fourth is free ports. And free ports, and I'll tell you now, free ports is where I think we would better fit. Those typically encompass larger areas, and they incorporate all types of activities. Tourism, retail. They actually permit on-site residence, which is something you don't really think about when you hear duty-free zones and so forth. Fifth, single factory zones, and of course, as it says, we're talking about a particular factory so that we know that particular factory dealing with that particular thing, they get their tax incentives and so forth. And then you have specialized zones, which may include a science or technology park, airport-based zone. So when we have the duty-free zones in the airports, for example, that is an example of a specialized zone. As I said, Madam Presiding Officer, that what we are proposing on this end is to think of the entire island of Tobago and think about having the possibility of the entire island be one of those free port zones where the entire island is a duty-free zone. Imagine being a person living in Trinidad and realizing that for the first time in probably the history of Trinidad and Tobago, it is cheaper to come to Tobago to buy things than it is in Trinidad. Imagine what that could do for us here. Madam Presiding Officer, how do we do this? I started doing a little bit of research because instead of trying to invent the wheel, it makes more sense to use the framework that we already have in Trinidad and Tobago to try to operationalize this. On the books, Madam Presiding Officer, we currently have a Trinidad and Tobago Free Zones Act, Chapter 8107, and this act allowed for the creation of the Trinidad and Tobago Free Zones Company Limited, which is one of those special purpose companies that works very closely with the ministry with responsibility for finance. That is the organization, Madam Presiding Officer, that currently allows any entity within Trinidad and Tobago to become a tax-free, duty-free entity. So the infrastructure to allow this to happen already exists in Trinidad and Tobago. So, Madam Presiding Officer, what we are suggesting as one of the possible options is to figure out how we could frame the policy of Tobago and say within the laws that we already have this company via the Act designate the island as a free zone. It is already done. It can be done. We simply need to work out the logistics of how it can be done. Madam Presiding Officer, we need to do this because the reality is we are playing catch-up. As much as this is the capital of paradise, both speakers before me have identified the fact that the economy of Tobago is struggling. We need help. As a matter of fact, in a Newsday article in June 2019, an economist wrote in that article, and I quote, "The output per person of Tobago is about US 4,700 in last year and the year before." The economist continued, and I quote, "It allows me to compare that to the national output per person of $16,200. So the national output per person is $16,200, and the output per person for Tobago is $4,700. And it continues. So Tobago, in essence, is 4 times poorer than Trinidad. And that is the problem that we currently need to solve. How do we get us to move up to scratch so that we can really stand side by side with Trinidad? What we are proposing, Madam Presiding Officer, and even though we've said several times that we've done studies in 2007, studies in 2010, if I'm not mistaken, is that we need to critically sit and collect all of the data. Because the fact that we are still pulling this from here and pulling that from there means that a real comprehensive study has not been done on what is the situation as is, and then the next step, which is to create a solution. Madam Presiding Officer, just to let us know again that the company that I'm talking about implements what the government of Trinidad and Tobago calls the Free Zone Program. And just so that we have a sense of what that entails, the website of the Trinidad and Tobago Free Zone Company Limited basically says that the company is set up to specifically encourage, and I quote, both foreign and local investors to set up manufacturing, international trading and service operations within free zones dedicated to exports, with a view of encouraging and facilitating new investments, the creation of jobs, the generation of net foreign exchange earnings, the deepening of the technology base of the country, the development of new and the increase of existing skills in the workplace, utilization of local raw materials, manufactured goods and services, and access to overseas markets. If we listen to anyone who talks about what Tobago needs to help us develop, those things are exactly what Tobago needs. So we already have the ready justification for having the entire island benefit from a project such as this. Madam Presiding Officer, how does this work in terms of how do you benefit? If you have been designated as a free zone according to the law, Madam Presiding Officer, it means that your functions are not, or you are exempted from certain types of taxes that would normally have to be paid by businesses, people, and so forth. This includes things like land and building tax, income tax, corporation tax, business levies, and so forth. What is good, though, Madam Presiding Officer, is that this Trinidad and Tobago Free Zone Company Limited has the authority to craft the rules that are associated with each entity. So we can state specifically in Tobago that for certain types of businesses, as Assemblyman Mr. Augustine had stated, maybe we reduce the VAT for certain items or for certain types of businesses, but not for others. So the fear that because we say Tobago is a tax-free zone does not necessarily mean that everything or every business on the island has to necessarily be tax-free. We may, for example, state that those in the banking sector may need to pay all of their taxes because of the volume of profits that they currently experience even within this system, while smaller companies that manufacture things using our local products and so forth, their tax bracket is different. Madam Presiding Officer, it's important to note that there really is a list of items or a list of the kinds of businesses or the kinds of activities that can be within that free zone, and this is listed in the first schedule of the Act. And just to run through them quickly: warehousing and storing, manufacturing operations, transshipment operation, loading and unloading, exporting, importing, service operation, which includes insurance, banking, and so forth, packaging and shipping, assembling, processing, merchandising, construction, sale, rental, and management of spaces, and so forth. It is important to note, though, and I guess for good reason, that it is also very clear in the law that activities that relate to natural gas and petroleum, even though it can happen within the free zone, will not be allowed to have the kinds of tax breaks that we are talking about. Madam Presiding Officer, going back to the transshipment option that is listed, and particularly since the member for Bacolet Mount St. George specifically praised the fact that our inter-island transportation system seems to be working a little bit better, and kind of focusing on that, also highlighting the fact that, again, we've been talking for umpteen years about having ports in Tobago that are designated as international or regional or CARICOM ports. I think we need to go a step further, because these are things that we've known. We know that we would benefit from having our goods dropped in Tobago first, and then the ship continues off to Trinidad. We know that. But what we are wondering is what has actually happened? What steps were actually taken to ensure that our ports have that kind of designation? So yes, we know that it can happen. Yes, we go out and we boast about Tobago being in the best place for transshipment goods to come in and drop here and then go to Trinidad. But what steps have we actually taken to ensure that that happens here? And if we add the added benefit of having Tobago be designated as one of those free zones, then we may see an entirely new industry where everyone in Trinidad may recognize that it is indeed cheaper to have your goods dropped in Tobago, and then we take them to Trinidad after they've been dropped here.
Remember, you have 10 more minutes.
Thank you. Madam Presiding Officer, these are the specific things that we are looking at, those of us on this side of the bench. Because we recognize, Madam Presiding Officer, that we need to go a little further. I was excited when I heard the member for Bacolet stand and say, "You are wrong, Assemblyman Farley." And I thought I would have heard him say, here is the comprehensive study that we just did last year or year before, and it so happens that we on this side simply don't know about it. But then as I listened, I recognized that he was really simply repeating everything that the Assemblyman that represents the far northeast said. Which means that we continue to come into this house and instead of just agreeing to do something good, because it is the good thing to do, we will continue to come in here and say, we did this, we did that, we did this, we did that, we did this, we did that, when in fact, the reality is nothing or very close to nothing has been done. And because of that, Madam Presiding Officer, it is important for all of us sitting in here to note, and it is important for the Tobagonians who are out there dealing with the fact that we are 4 times poorer than the average Trinidadian. What we need to know is that it is absolutely time for us to hand over the management of what happens here to people who would stop saying we did, when in fact nothing has been done, and hand over those reins to people who are ready, who are willing, who are change agents, and who are fighters ready to rumble. Because that is what Tobago needs. And Madam Presiding Officer, I would end by reminding us that we are people who deserve better. We deserve better. And if what has been happening has not made you better, then you need to decide, what do we need to do to make this better? I know I do. I know my family does. I know my friends do. They deserve better. And it is time that we stop saying that we're doing something and, in fact, get it done. I thank you.
Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Madam Presiding Officer, for the opportunity to contribute for the first time in this new year 2020. And of course, let me take the opportunity to wish all of us in this chamber and all of Tobago by extension and Trinidad and Tobago a happy, bright, and prosperous 2020. And of course, for us in the PNM, this year has started off with much excitement. As a matter of fact, I'm battling a cough at this point in time, so I seem to have come down with the internal election fever, Madam Presiding Officer. And of course, these are interesting and exciting times. But as I contribute to this motion, I'll try my best to not do too much politicking. Because, of course, I think it's a serious issue for Tobago at this point in time. It is, in fact, a timely motion, and I'll go as far as to congratulate the member for Palatovia Lands on his side for his perspicacity in this matter, and of course, for his willingness to bring this motion to the House at this particular time. And we on the majority side, we do support the motion, and of course, the process by which we achieve the objectives is going to be up for much discussion, much consultation in going forward. So I would just like to inject just a couple new considerations that I don't think I heard any of the previous speakers mention, but considerations that are critical nonetheless, Madam Presiding Officer. And I want to start with the why, because of course, most of the speakers that spoke before me identified a number of issues. And I think all of us must be honest and admit that here in Tobago, especially as it relates to home construction, I myself had the experience back in 2015, I think it was, when I was doing some home improvement to my mother's house. And in purchasing electrical material, and not only electrical, but even as it relates to a simple thing as tile, I went to One Hardware in Tobago, and a 24-inch by 24-inch porcelain tile was $60, Madam Presiding Officer, one tile. And the same tile in Trinidad, if memory serves me correct, was I think somewhere between $24 and $30, Madam Presiding Officer. And of course, being the smart individual that I am, I simply got a quotation from Tile Warehouse, I think was the name of the place, and I recognized that I could save as much as 50% if I were to purchase the materials in Trinidad. So I borrowed a friend's van, went to Trinidad, and came back to Tobago with the material. And of course, I was able to save, can't remember exactly, but somewhere around $8,000 to $10,000, Madam Presiding Officer. So of course, there are those considerations, and we have to find a way to bring equity in terms of the cost of living between those in Trinidad and of course us here living in Tobago. And that is important. But I'm also saying of equal importance is our development agenda, especially with relation to tourism, with relation to clean energy, light manufacturing, and all those other areas that Tobago can tap into to advance our private sector operations here in Tobago, Madam Presiding Officer. Because we say time and time again that the Tobago House of Assembly employs approximately 60–65% of the working population in Tobago. And we say time and time again that that trend must not continue. And therefore, in order for us to provide employment for the young upcoming persons, for those now coming into the job market, those who have already been in the job market for some time without suitable employment opportunities, it is important for us, Madam Presiding Officer, to continue to develop a robust private sector on the island of Tobago. And therefore, one has to consider the effect of our tax regime, the effect of our tax systems on this agenda, Madam Presiding Officer. Because when we compare ourselves, because of course in Tobago we depend heavily on tourism, And much of our plans with relation to our development can be compared to what obtains on other islands. Islands such as Grenada, Barbados, St. Lucia, and many others, Madam Presiding Officer. And those islands have been able, we must admit, to attract the levels of investment from, of course, foreign companies in most instances. Levels of investment that we have not been able to attract, of course, not until recently when we had the opportunity to have a Sandals resort, and we all knew what transpired with that, Madam Presiding Officer. And therefore, I want to discuss very briefly how Tobago can and should benefit in the very near future on what may not necessarily be a tax-free arrangement, but I would want to call it a tax-friendly arrangement, Madam Presiding Officer. Because, of course, tax-free status gives the impression that there will be no taxes across the board, Madam Presiding Officer. But I want to start, well, I already started with the why, but I want to continue with the how. Because interestingly, the all-important matter of internal self-government is before us at this point in time. And notwithstanding the minority councillor spoke about the company that, of course, has the responsibility to designate areas in Tobago as tax-free zones or duty-free zones. But I want to speak to the issue of internal self-government, and specifically Chapter 141 AH of the bill that is before, or the draft bill that is before the Joint Select Committee at this point in time. Because, of course, all of us, of course, the THE and individuals, Tobagonians, every single member of the public had an opportunity to contribute your views, to share your ideas or suggestions with relation to that draft bill. So I want to read that part of it, and also want to read onto the record a submission that was made by me via email to that Joint Select Committee. So that part of the bill says, Madam Presiding Officer, upon the coming into force of this chapter, draft estimates shall be submitted to the Cabinet before the expiration of 3 months from the date of the first sitting of the House of the Assembly, held following the meeting in Section 141D. It goes on to say, all draft estimates, capital and recurrent, subsequent to those referred to in subsection 3, shall be submitted to Cabinet before the third quarter of each financial year. And my contribution or my submission to that part reads as follows. There should be no requirement for the Tobago Island government, because of course that is what is going to be called in the new dispensation, to submit any draft estimates to the Cabinet or the National Parliament. Tobago should be funded primarily by a block grant from central government, authorized borrowing, and the collection of stipulated taxes in Tobago. Tobago should also have legislative authority with respect to taxes levied on Tobagonians. And of course, that is my personal view, Madam Presiding Officer. And that is exactly what I want to discuss, but let me read the rest. The Constitution should prescribe that the Secretary responsible for finance cause to be prepared and laid before the Tobago Parliament after and no later than 15 days after the passage of the national budget, estimates of revenues and expenditure of the Tobago Island government for that year. But again, I want to deal specifically with the issue of decentralized taxes. Because while the minority councillor said that we should depend on this company to designate Tobago as a tax-free or a duty-free zone, I am saying that going forward, especially under any new arrangement through internal self-government, the government of Tobago should have the responsibility to set taxes here in Tobago. And of course, I know that issue is going to be a highly debatable one. I know when it comes to decentralization and when it comes to autonomy, there is always much debate about which responsibility should and should not be decentralized. And I know that the issue of taxes is going to be a ticklish area, Madam Presiding Officer. But I'm saying Tobago should have the responsibility to determine our destiny, to determine our future. And part of that is determining our development agenda, determining how and when we are able to attract foreign investment. And when I say foreign investment, I'm also considering our neighbors in Trinidad, Madam Presiding Officer. So, of course, the member for Palataville, Lansame Speyside, mentioned the word socialist. But I consider it more capitalism, Madam Presiding Officer. Because I think apart from the benefits that Tobagonians will derive, of course, if you have a situation where there are no income taxes, persons will have more money available to spend or to put below the bed. As we have seen in recent times, pastors have had millions of dollars in envelopes in rooms. We have seen where barbers as well have had either $1 million or $2 million stacked up somewhere else. And we know, of course, a number of our citizens prefer to put their money below the mattress and those kinds of things. But of course, it is going to do some good for the economy in that it will encourage greater consumption. It will encourage persons to have more flexibility in terms of their lifestyle, how they live, the quality of life that they enjoy, Madam Presiding Officer. So, of course, those are very obvious benefits. But I tend to share a slight disagreement with respect to duty-free versus a tax-friendly situation, and I'll say why. Of course, under a duty-free arrangement, it means that most goods and services will be available free of duty, free of customs taxes and whatever other taxes may be applied to imported goods. So it means that Cadbury chocolates, Madam Presiding Officer, will be cheaper. It means that punching, where punching come from again? Don't know, you know. Punching and all those other, and vodka and all those other, those foreign alcoholic beverages, Madam Presiding Officer, will be cheaper. But I'm saying, in the context of Tobago, rather than just taking a blanket approach to a duty-free arrangement, I'm saying that we should try to focus specifically on those locally made items, Tobago-made chocolates, Tobago-made wines, whether it be sea grapes wines or Susumba wine, or sea moss wine or sea moss punch. Those indigenous, local Tobago-made products, Madam Presiding Officer. I'm saying those artisans, those people that we train to get involved in art and craft, to get involved in courses like bread cakes and pastries, to learn to make local juices, local beverages, those Tobago locally made products, Madam Presiding Officer, those individuals are the ones that should benefit from a duty-free arrangement. So the question is, how do we drive the consumption of those local products? And I'm saying we can't do that if we allow punching to benefit, vodka to benefit. Help me name some of them. I'm not a drinker. Barefoot wine to benefit, yellowtail wine to benefit, because they will in fact compete, Madam Presiding Officer, with the lady in Speyside who makes sea grapes wine. Or the young man, there's a young man in Tobago, I can't remember his name now, but he makes a number of, I'm trying to remember the name of the company, a number of juices and beverages. The name will come, I think it's a guy McKellar or something like that is his name. Can't remember the name offhand. Garrett McKellar is the name of the fella. Something, these are the persons you want to benefit. You want to drive the consumption, especially when our visitors come to the island. They must go in the mall or the rum shop or wherever and discover that it is cheaper to buy a local wine than a bottle of punch, Madam Presiding Officer. Something that is the kind of arrangement that we should be pursuing here in Tobago. But of course, it will also allow us to be a bit more attractive than we are at this point in time with relation to investment. Investment from a corporate perspective in terms of those companies, whether it be hotels, vehicle manufacturers. I see no reason why companies such as Tesla and those other companies now getting into the electric vehicle market. I see no reason why a place like Tobago cannot be considered. But I'm saying we have to make the policies, we have to put ourselves in a position where their presence here will be advantageous to them versus somewhere in the States or whatever. I'm saying that, Madam Presiding Officer. But of course, there will also be opportunities for individuals where, and it's a ticklish issue in Tobago, where of course there are certain designated areas where foreigners, expats could come to Tobago, purchase land in certain areas, and they contribute to the local economy. They not only buy property, and of course they will pay the stamp duties and those taxes associated with that, but in many instances they hire locals. In many instances they may start a business. And I'm saying there are other islands, when these individuals look at the options available, there are other islands that are far more attractive than us at this point in time, Madam Presiding Officer. So I think generally, a tax-free Tobago will help Trinidad and Tobago. Because I'm seeing a situation where Tobago becomes the tax-free location in Trinidad and Tobago. You may have the possibility of Trinidadians coming to Tobago to benefit from that. To, of course, maybe establish businesses. It might be the preferred location as it relates to vacations. Because, of course, in many instances, you have Trinidadians, 1.3 million of them on that island. Many of them go to other destinations such as Barbados, Grenada, St. Lucia, etc. And I'm saying with a tax-free arrangement, Tobago can in fact become more attractive, not only for vacations, but also for the purpose of investment and private sector investment, Madam Presiding Officer. So again, I'm saying it's not so much socialist as it is capitalist, advancing our private sector, giving people, especially people here in Tobago, the freedom to live a higher quality of life, the freedom to spend more, the freedom to save more, the freedom to put more below the bed. And hopefully one day, if the government calls for new bills to be implemented into the system, you're going to have a situation where maybe an assemblyman can go to the bank, not $1 million, maybe $500,000 in cash, Madam Presiding Officer.
I don't want to be no party to that.
One assemblyman doesn't want to be a party to that. So of course you have the private sector benefits. But I'm saying, Madam Presiding Officer, it will also encourage creativity in the Tobago space. Because of course, in some sectors it is already applicable. In the agriculture sector, you already have a situation where I think all agricultural supplies and equipment are duty-free. So of course, farmers could benefit from that. It also
Remember, you have
applies.
10 more minutes speaking time.
I'll be finished in 5, Madam Presiding Officer. So of course, you have even in the tourism sector, opportunities for investors in that sector to benefit from lower taxes, Madam Presiding Officer. So of course, all in all, it is something that we have to consider in the very near future. It is something that we must do at some point in time to ensure that Tobago is in an advantageous position, or a more advantageous position than our neighbors, so that we can attract the kind of investment, both local investment and foreign investment, so that we could give our small businesses, our entrepreneurs, the breathing space, the opportunity in some sectors, Madam Presiding Officer, because I'm saying as well that, of course, tax-friendly in the Tobago context could mean zero income tax, zero inheritance tax, zero capital gains tax, and zero tax on gifts and those sort of things. But of course, some level of corporate taxes will still apply. But I'm saying we can identify specific sectors, maybe the tourism sector, where we can offer to both foreigners, the foreign companies coming in, and local individuals who are involved in the same sectors. Because we have this thing, and it applies in a number of Caribbean destinations, where of course the big major companies can come in and benefit from tax holidays. But some of the local persons involved in the same sectors are catching their royal and can't benefit from any tax incentives, Madam Presiding Officer. So I'm saying it has to apply across the board, Madam Presiding Officer. So of course, on the corporate side, we can identify some sectors. The tourism sector, of course, is going to be one of them. The agricultural sector has already gone in that direction following the last national budget, Madam Presiding Officer. We can also encourage our local artisans, our craft makers, our beverage makers, our food processors, by ensuring that they can benefit, of course, from zero income taxes, but also from duty-free arrangements when it comes to the importation of raw materials and other supplies that may be needed to operate in those businesses, Madam Presiding Officer. And finally, it will be remiss of me to not consider the cost of this, because many of us will ask, and I'm sure persons around the table, persons outside of this chamber might ask, well, where is the money coming from? And can Tobago afford to go tax-free? But I'm saying based on our small population and based on our small tax base, meaning the amount of people who are paying taxes, I think it is very affordable. And of course, I'm speaking without doing the suggested research and the suggested studies, but I'm saying looking at it from a layman's perspective, when you examine the draft estimates of revenues and expenditure of the Tobago space, you recognize that we only collect somewhere between $200 to $300 million in taxes. And I'm saying we can afford here in Tobago to give up that $200 to $300 million in exchange for the kind of investment that this kind of arrangement is expected to attract. So without further ado, I want to say again that I support this motion, and I look forward to us here in a P&M controlled assembly moving towards this direction, Madam Presiding Officer.
Member for Palatuvia, Lance for me, Speyside.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer, and thank you to all who have contributed to this debate. I think for the Tobagonians looking on, this is not a bad start for 2020. Maybe those on the other side should have internal elections every year. It will shake people up a bit and bring them more to seeing the real vision and hopes of the people of Tobago, and will make them even more magnanimous. So we all agree. And I'm also happy, Madam Presiding Officer, that I was able to move from being erroneous to having perspicacity. And I forgave the member from Bacalet Monk St. George. I know his head is still hot, and I know for him things might be hanging in the balance, so he's stressed out. But I want to be very clear that the motion in no form or fashion made any negative assumptions about what the Executive Council is doing, have done, or is not doing. It's very general, it's open, and it simply requires that we do the necessary extensive research that we should do, and that we look, even in that research, at the merits of tax-free initiatives and or duty-free initiatives. And I listened to the member for Bacalet Monk St. George who, was saying that, we have some research doing and so on. We have been doing some research and it's recent, but I still don't think the research he spoke to, that's at least a decade old, can be considered recent. Additionally, he spoke primarily to the issue of food and hardware supplies. And the matter of cost of living is far wider than just food and hardware supplies. We have to consider transportation, as I spoke to. We have to consider the cost of rent, the cost of articles of clothing, the cost of education, the cost of entertainment, the cost of administration. Every time a Tobagonian must take a flight or a boat to go to Trinidad to have land matters resolved, that too adds to the cost of living on the island. And so there is still need for us to do that extensive research, and I'm happy that by the time we got around to the member for Boko, we would have arrived at consensus in that regard. A few other things of note. I want to thank my colleague, Councillor Dr. Faith B. Israel, for looking at varying options within a duty-free framework so that we can see what is available to us, what exists in the world. And I want to add that as we do this research and as we consider policies to follow up, we must also understand that we are free to do something novel and different from what we have seen in the rest of the world, because Tobago is a unique space. And our conditions are unique enough that sometimes we just have to consider being innovative, or being novel rather, with what we put out there. I wish to also say to the member from Boko that I am not as sold on a tax-free island. Because while I agree that this arrangement could become part of the new Tobago House of Assembly, the new Tobago Island government, that we want, that body that will be far more autonomous. And while at the present moment, we are raking in 200 to 300 million in taxes, at some point in the future, I want to see a Tobago where all multinationals pay their taxes in Tobago for the businesses they do in Tobago. And that will include the banks. That will include the oil companies in our waters, because we are not allowing the central parliament, the central government, to pass an arrangement for Tobago where we don't have some form of control or jurisdictions over our sovereign waters. And so to throw the idea out of tax-free arrangement and predicate it on $200 to $300 million of taxes that we collect now might be a bit short-sighted, because down the road our taxable capacity ought to increase with an increase in our autonomy. And that's the only reason why I wouldn't go full tax-free. And I will let the member know that one of Tobago's famed economists suggested that we should finally put the motion as tax-free. And I said, let's not be too busy with that arrangement. But it's worth considering, Because at the end of the day, Madam Presiding Officer, we are agreeing that the cost of living on the island of Tobago is exponentially higher than Trinidad. We are agreeing that the cost of living on the island of Tobago provides some impediments to development on the island, provides impediments to our creativity, to innovation, to family life, to development of our infrastructure, to development of private enterprise. So we are agreeing on all of that. And we are also agreeing that we need to do something post-haste. And I want to end by saying, I want us to actually do this. Let us do this. Let us make this something that we do, not just a nice sounding motion that we pass, and then 2021 we return here. Well, some of us will return here, hopefully. And we at it again, and the problem is still there on the ground. Tobagonians are looking for us to actively address the issue of the cost of living on the island. It impacts all of us. Yes, that includes assembly men. That includes secretaries. It impacts all of us because we live here. And so hopefully with whatever arrangements we are able to come up with out of our research, we will be able to drive sectors like the tourism sector, drive sectors, indigenous sectors, that is especially those within the food sector, especially those in arts and craft, drive those sectors upwards so that the taxable capacity of the island will simultaneously increase, and so that we will all be able to afford to live on the closest thing to heaven, Tobago. Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer.
Members, the question put is, whereas it is a widely held perception that the cost of living in Tobago is generally higher than that in Trinidad, and whereas there is no recent study to examine the current cost of living differentials between both islands, and whereas some Tobagonians attempt to circumvent the high costs of goods and services by going to Trinidad to shop, and whereas the Supermarkets Association of Trinidad and Tobago warned in a statement dated January 4, 2020, that there will be price increases as suppliers have increased their prices, and whereas the duties and consumption taxes attached to goods and services exacerbate the problem for residents and even make tourism and other products and services on the islands less competitive, be it resolved that this House asks the Executive Council to commission an extensive study on the cost of living differentials between both islands and the merits of duty-free and or tax-free initiatives for the island. And be it further resolved that the report of this study be laid in this House, and that this study be used to inform policy initiatives to treat with the economic realities of Tobagonians. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. The motion is carried. Leader of Assembly Business.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. I beg to move that this House now stand adjourned to a date to be fixed.
Members, the question is that this House stands adjourned to a date to be fixed. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it.